So today's video is going to be on what is a quadratic equation. And a quadratic equation is anything with an x, and the highest x in the equation is raised to the second power. There's a 2 in the index. So this would be a quadratic equation. This would be a quadratic equation. This would be a quadratic equation. But this would not be a quadratic equation. Because if we FOILed this out, we would get x is equal x times x plus 1 times x plus 1 is equal to 0. X squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. X cubed plus 2x squared plus x is equal to 0. So that is how we determine whether we have a quadratic equation or not. So we have an ultimate quadratic equation. It's called the quadratic equation, and this is where it comes from. This is the formal proof. If we take a generic quadratic equation with coefficients a, b, and c, we can subtract a c from both sides. When we do that, we'll get ax squared plus bx is equal to negative c. We're then going to divide both sides by a to get a squared plus b over a times x plus the quantity b over 2a squared equals negative c over a plus b over 2a squared. And that's from a technique called completing the square, which will be the second video. So after you've gone and taken the course in completing the square, come back here and see if you can give it a shot for yourself. So after there, we have the quantity x plus b over 2a squared is going to be equal to negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. Now, something that I missed that I really should tell you is remember that our original premise had this general polynomial equal to 0, and that's huge. So in order to even use this equation when all said and done, you always have to have the equation equaling 0, or else it'll come out wrong every single time. Those are the conditions for the equation to work. So now we're gonna find a common denominator and make them into a fraction, and then what we're going to do is square both sides. Now when we square both sides, it's going to be a plus or minus. So remember, with these equations, you're going to get two answers out, and that's what we'd expect from a square. Now we're going to subtract the b over 2a from both sides, and since they both have a denominator of 2a, we can have our final equation being x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And that is the quadratic equation. So when we're solving quadratic equations, we have three tools in our belt. We can use factoring, which only works when we're dealing with nice numbers. So that you can only factor something really if it breaks up into integers. That's the only way. That's when we use that. When something won't factor, what we do is we use the quadratic equation. So we use the quadratic equation, and that works every single time. As long, there's only one condition here, our whole quadratic equation has to be equal to 0 on one side. So the right side must be 0. And then the last one is completing the square, which we'll cover next. So for these ones, we're going to practice quadratic equation. And my go-ahead is if you're stuck on a question and it's a quadratic and you're taking more than 5 minutes to factor it, just plug it into the quadratic equation. Don't waste any more time. So you're going to find that the quadratic equation is super nice. It always works, as long as our right side's equal to 0. So this first question we have x squared plus 3x plus 4 is equal to 0. So we could break this down. We can't break this down into factoring. We'll have 1 times 4. That won't work because one of those would have to be negative, and that would give us a negative 4. And we have 2 and 2. That won't work either. So what we have to do is say, hey, we got to use a quadratic equation here. So what we're going to do is plug that in, and we're going to get x is equal to, so what I usually do here is first write my a. So my a on this coefficient, there's no coefficient here, so the a is equal to 1. The coefficient on the x term is 3, so b equals 3. And c is equal to 4. So we're going to plug that into our formula that we developed a minute ago. And that'll be negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 4. All over 2a, which would be 1. So we're going to just solve this. Negative 3 plus or minus. So the square root here, that 3 squared is going to be a 9. Minus 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. Divided by 2. Now what's going to happen is we're going to get a negative number in the square root if we solve next. And at this point we don't know how to deal with anything negative in the square root symbol. So what we're going to do is ignore this problem for right now. We don't have the skill to deal with imaginary numbers here. If you want, you can look those up, but we're not gonna be dealing with those quite yet. We have 4x squared plus 5x plus 2 is equal to 3. So what we're going to do is first take the 3 to the other side, because remember, for the quadratic equation to work, it has to be equal to 0 on the right side. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. That gives us our new polynomial quadratic to be 4x squared plus 5x minus 1 is equal to 0. So now we see that we can't really factor it, so what we're going to do is plug it into the quadratic equation. So we get negative, well, let's write our a's. A is equal to 4, b is equal to 5, c is equal to negative 1. Negative b, which is 5, plus or minus square root of b squared, 25, minus 4. A is 4, c is negative 1, divided by 2a. So, first thing is we got to tackle the square root. We're going to have 25, negative 4 times 4 is negative 16, times negative 1 is positive 16. And then 2 times 4 is 8. Negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 16 would be 41. Make that 1 closer. Divided by 8. So this would be our solution. We would have x is equal to negative 5 plus square root of 41 over 8 and negative 5 minus the square root of 41 over 8. So we see that since it is a square, we're going to have two answers. We're going to have two x's. For this next one, we're going to have to factor it first. So first we're going to FOIL. We can't factor it right now because it's not equal to 0. So what we're going to do is FOIL this out. That is going to give us x squared plus 3x plus 2x plus 6 is equal to 3. And then we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. When we do that, we're going to get x squared plus 3, first off, let's combine those. This right here is going to be 5x. So we'll get 5x plus 3. Now we're going to write our a is equal to 1, b is equal to 5, and our c is equal to 3. When we plug this into our equation, we're going to get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus 4 times 1 times 3 divided by 2 times our a, which is 1. So we're going to get, so first we're going to solve that square root first. We're going to get 25 minus negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times 3 is 12. Negative 12. So we're going to then solve the square root to be 25 minus 12. 25 minus 12 is 13 over 2. So our final answer is x is equal to negative 5 plus square root of 13 divided by 2. And x is also equal to negative 5 minus square root of 13 divided by 2. Those are the two answers we can get from that quadratic. Let's take a look at when we're missing a term. So when we're missing an x term, or our linear term, you'll know that from the last lesson. A linear term is just an x raised to the first power. Our go-to is almost always going to be a quadratic equation. So for here, our right side is equal to 0, so our a is going to be equal to 5, our b is equal to 0, and our c is equal to 7. What we're going to do now is plug this into our quadratic equation. We get 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times 5 times 7 over 2 times 7. We should see right here that this is going to be something we can't solve because it'll be negative under a square root. So what we're going to do, just for sake of argument, let's change this over here to a negative 5x. So that'll change this. Well, if we did that, then we would be able to solve it because this will be a positive. Plus or minus square root of negative 4 times negative 5 is 20 times 7 divided by 2 times 7 is 4. No, this should not be 7 here. This should be a negative 5. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. Okay, so then we have the plus or minus square root of 140 over negative 10. So now what we're going to do is see if we can pull anything out of this root real quick. We'll have a plus or minus. Well, we can take a 4 out. If we take a 4 out, we are going to get a 35. So if we take 4 out of here, we're going to get this. And remember, 4 is just 2 squared times 35 over negative 10. So what we're going to do is pull that 2 out with, so we'll get plus or minus 2 square root of 35 over 10. What we're going to do now is cancel the 2 with the 10, simplify that up, we get plus or minus the square root of 35 over 5. That's what x equals. So x is equal to square root of 35 over 5 and negative square root of 35 over 5. Okay, for our last quadratic equation, we have sort of the same thing we had with our last problem, except we have a number over there, so you know what to do. Let's take over this number, this 5, over to the other side by subtracting it. That gives us the equation 4x squared minus 6 is equal to 0. What we're going to do now is use our quadratic equation. Actually, if we wanted to, a little technique we could do here is factor a 2 out. They both have a 2 in common, so that would give us 2x squared minus 3 is equal to 0. Well, if we divide 2 by both sides, we'll get 2x squared minus 3 is equal to 0. So now what we got to do is plug this guy into the quadratic equation. We're going to have our a equaling 2, b equaling 0, c equaling negative 3. So what we do is negative 0 plus or minus square root of 0 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 3 over 2 times 2 because a is equal to 2. So what we're going to do now is simplify underneath the root. Well, this is 0. So all our zeros are going to go away, so we'll get plus or minus x is equal plus or minus square root of negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 3 is positive 24. Divided by 2 times 2 is 4. That'll give us, so now we can factor out a 4 out of the 24. That's usually what I try to do, is I usually try to break things into 4, so that'll give us a 2 squared times 6 divided by 4. That 2 squared makes it a 2 on the outside of the square root sign. And then the 2 reduces with the 4 on the bottom. So x is equal to plus or minus square root of 6 over 2. And if we wanted to write that out, we could write x is equal to square root of 6 over 2 minus square root of 6 over 2. And those are our answers. So that covers what a quadratic equation is and how to use the quadratic equation. Next we'll be looking at completing the square and how it's used when we want to solve quadratic equations. Have a good day.